So now that our camera is automatically set up to resize itself based on the resolution of the game, we can go in and start building out the level for our game. Let's select all these items that we were testing with and delete them from the hierarchy view. Also, we'll want to set the camera back to size 80. This way, when we're laying things out, we'll be able to see them in the game preview. For now, we'll leave it at 1024 by 768. You'll see that we're using a resolution of 360 by 270 because my monitor is a little bit smaller. If I was to increase this or decrease this, you would see a larger resolution size. Likewise, when you're testing, you could do maximize on play to see the full screen. So in order for us to do the background, we're going to need to go back into our artwork folder and take a look at our texture. Let's start with the wall texture. Now, by default, this was imported as a sprite. Here, we're going to convert this back into a texture. Then, what we can actually do is modify the wrap mode to allow it to repeat. We still want to change the filter mode to point, and we can go back to the format and we can set this to true color and hit apply. Now, our texture will repeat whenever we add it to a surface. In this case, let's create a simple game object that will allow us to apply the texture and represent our background. We'll go to the Game Object menu, we'll go to the 3D list, and we'll create a quad. Now, the quad is going to be really small because the pixels to units in our game are so high. If we double-click on our quad and zoom in, you'll take a look at what this is. It's very similar to a plane, but it's actually comprised of two triangles. If we were to go into 2D mode, you would see that the quad disappears because there's no background texture for it. Now, I like to use quads because 1, they're very efficient, and 2, they allow me to do things like resize them and scale them and give me a large surface to attach artwork to, especially a background in a 2D game. Now, let's change this quad to match the size of the texture we're going to apply to it. We're going to go over to its scale and set this to 32 by 32. Again, if we double-click on the quad in the hierarchy, we'll zoom out. And here, you'll get a good estimate of what this is looking like in our game. Next, we're going to want to change the Z of this object to be a little bit further away from the camera. Now, when we work in the 2D part of Unity, we don't actually have to worry about Z, but because this is a 3D object, and we're going to add a few different quads over the next few videos, we want to make sure that they're layered correctly. In this case, we're going to set it to 2, which will push it further away from the camera. To give you a point of reference, if you look at the camera, the Z index for the camera is set to -10. Now, back on our quad, you'll see it looks kind of boring. Now, in order for us to actually apply a texture to it, we're going to have to create something called a material. In our Assets folder, let's create a new folder called Materials. And inside of Materials, we're going to create our first material. Let's call this Wall Texture. Now, for the point of this course, we're just going to pick a very simple shader that'll help us render the texture in a way that'll let us repeat the background. Shaders alter the way the materials look in the game. In this case, we're simply going to go to Mobile, Particles, Alpha Blended, and you'll see the options have now changed based on the shader that we're using. Here, we can select a texture. We'll hit the Select button, and we'll scroll down, and we'll find our wall texture. Now we have our wall texture set. If we were to drag this wall texture over to our quad, you'll now see that our wall texture appears in the background. In the next video, we'll talk about how tiling works and how to resize this so that it fills up the entire screen.